Wow. Well, it's really fun to be here. I was not prepared for how beautiful this place is, both the campus and the town and the views and all of it. So already you guys have kind of opened my eyes to new vistas in real ways. We're going to start with just sort of getting to know each other. Some of you already know each other. I don't know any of you. Well, I know like two of you now. So that you have some cards in front of you. Those of you who are online, we've got little slides that will show with some pictures of cards on them that you can participate in talking to yourself. But we're going to talk to each other in this room. So what I'm going to ask you to do, we're going to do 4 rounds of this, is take a minute and sort of familiarize yourself with your card. And in a second, I'm going to invite you to find a partner. So this is a get up and move situation. And you're going to have just a couple of minutes with that partner to answer a question about your 2 cards. You're going to summarize your card for your partner and then answer the question. Does that make sense? Okay. We can do this. I'm sure we can. Okay. All right. So this is from a deck of cards called the Hatch deck. I'll explain this to you later, but if you're wondering where these came from. So, okay, first of all, take a second and get familiar with your card, and then when I ding the bell, find a partner and choose which card you think is the most creative, yours or your partner's, okay? As you can see, this is a very scientific exercise. So you will just go with your gut on this, all right? All right, so go ahead and get familiar with it, and I'll ring the bell in just a minute. You need a card. If you need a card, put your hand up. Micah will deliver. Okay, you'll get more familiar with it as you go. We're just going to go ahead and get up and find yourself a partner. You can cheat on the first one and just turn to the person beside you if you want to, but you're going to eventually have to get up and move. Ready? Go. Thank you. Oh. You know, you get the you have to screw your light on. If you need a partner, just turn to the closest body you find. Which one is the most creative? Go. One more minute. right, so now is your chance to switch partners. And the next question, you're going to do the same thing. Introduce yourself to your partner. Summarize the ministry card that you've got, and decide between the two of you which ministry do you think has the most impact. Okay? All right, go. And remember impact, because I'm going to put the next one on the screen. Okay, go. All right, I got to do two things at once here then. Okay, which one do you have?
I have how do you say, Ciudad Nueva? New city.
Ciudad Nueva, yeah, I think it's, yeah. So
this is a community outreach group based in El Paso, Texas, with focusing on the El Paso Grande neighborhood and basically helping to transform that.
Yep.
They've been, 4 areas they focus on is empowering youth through children's programs from 3 to 12, supporting families through job referrals and contacting neighborhood resources, strengthening communities by facilitating opportunities for community members to come together. So I presume community members would be organizations that are already there.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
The other one is equipping leaders by equipping and mobilizing students and adult leaders in the community.
Yeah.
It's founded by a guy by the name of Cliff Warner.
So these are kind of similar. So this is a church in Detroit, Episcopal church, where 60% of the population of the church are African American guys under 30.
Wow.
Yeah, and so they've got all of these community impact things. They've got like over 200 units of affordable housing. They help people with employment. Wow. They've got a marching band and a cheer team and a step team and stuff, which I think would be fun. Cool. They've got a bike shop, a mentorship program, and a leather goods store, 100 other things. They've got a bow tie company.
Oh my God.
Isn't that hilarious?
So there are all these companies that are working and making money.
And the church is providing the surrounding infrastructure to let that happen. Cool. So which one do you think has most impact? I don't know.
I don't know. I think
they're pretty even, aren't they?
Yeah, because they're really in community.
And they're doing multiple ways. Yeah, with pretty targeted underserved populations, both of them.
Yes. So I'd say that would be it.
Tell me your name.
My name is Brian Keyser.
Brian, nice to meet you. I'm Kenda.
Nice to meet you. We live in
Princeton. Yeah. All right, let me get this party going here. All right, you're going to change partners again. You're halfway through. And this time you're going to repeat the same process, but the question is, which ministry do you think uses resources best, or has the best way of using resources? Now, one clue to that, and it's not very specific, because most of the information for this came off of websites, right? But one clue to this, you'll see on the back, there are 6 M's for each ministry, and one of them is money, right? So, well done. Yeah. So, anyway, take a second. You got 2 minutes. Go ahead, and which one you think has the most impact? Go. All right, last round. Find a new partner one more time. All right. Last round. And this time the question is, which of these ministries smells most like church? Okay? Which ministry smells most like church? Go. All right, you can have a seat. Thank you for playing. Well, let me ask a couple questions before we get into the heart of things. And I'm just curious about what is your response to being able to encounter these various cards from people? Just throw out some reactions that you had. Okay, it was fun. All right, what else? Other reactions to the cards. There's a lot going on out there. Yeah, right. What else? There's a huge array. Right. Go ahead. You sort of got invested in telling the story about the ministry that you were shepherding at that moment. Yeah. Any other thoughts as you were playing with these? Okay, here's an important question. Whose birthday is closest to today? Is today? All right. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Dan. Happy birthday to you. And as a little present, Chris is going to collect all of these and give them to you to take home. So the box is right there. And I've got another box. Stephen, where'd Stephen go? Is he still in here? He's teaching the course about, so you can have the other box before we go. So, all right. Happy birthday. All right, so here we are. And I don't know whether you've seen this meme or not. This is my favorite meme of the last couple of years. So it just sort of feels like reality right now. So it turns out that we are shepherding a lot of things that have been under the surface for a while, but they were laid bare by the pandemic, and then things only succeeded in getting even more complicated. Most churches are having to juggle about 4 different crises at once, right? The most obvious one is financial, right? Our financial models that we've had for the last 100 years don't work. And we get panicky about that because we're like, oh my gosh, how are we going to fund it if we don't have the offering plate that's going to sustain us. But we forget that the offering plate was itself an innovation. It wasn't until the late 19th century that most churches passed a plate to make money. They had a series of different experiments up until that point, because in the century before, the pattern was the government funded church life. And here in North America, we said, yeah, that's not going to work for us forever. And so we're going to have to find other ways to be able to supplement that. And so anyway, it took a while, but eventually somebody said, hey, let's crowdfund this. And they started passing a plate. And so we are now in another period of experimentation, trying to figure out these new financial models. But that is one of the places where there's a crisis of confidence in institutions. Another one is there's kind of an existential crisis that we're dealing with. What does it mean to be a congregation in a culture that no longer congregates the way we once did, right? What does it mean to be the gathered community of Christ when how we gather has fundamentally changed? So another of the crises that we deal with is kind of a developmental crisis. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. But the fact is not just, we talk about people, not being as faithful or as religious as they once, but the fact is it's not so much a matter of yes or no, I'm faithful. How people are faithful is actually changing. How people are developing religious identities is very different. And so what does that mean for the people of faith? And then finally, of course, political, the world's on fire. What are we going to do about that? So this is why most of us feel something like this. I just find this quite descriptive. Yeah. So anyway. So many of you had to read H. Richard Niebuhr at some point in your academic life, and one of the images that he uses is the image of shipwreck to describe what it feels like when the thing you thought would hold you absolutely gives way, right? And it's that experience of shipwreck that many of us have felt in our congregations, in our own faith development, in a lot of the ways that we have been interacting with people. It feels like the bottom has fallen out of something that we thought we could trust, and now we got to figure that out. You might remember the names of the two eels here. Who knows the names of the eels? Flotsam and Jetsam. Everybody who's got young children, any place in the last 30 years probably knows those eels. Flotsam and Jetsam, they wreak chaos on every place that they go, right? But of course, those are actual words, right? Jetsam is this stuff that you throw overboard in order to stay afloat, right? And flotsam is the broken up parts of the ship that you actually have bobbing around in the water after you've had a shipwreck. So I'm going to ask you to turn to a neighbor close by for a little conversation. Partners of two are ideal. If you can't do that, 3's okay, but it'll be a shorter conversation. And just play with this. If you're not going to get to all these questions, pick the one that you like the best, right? In the past few years, has anything come apart in your boat, in your ministry, in your faith, that you thought would hold? Have you thrown anything overboard in order to stay afloat? What do you find yourself clinging to in the wreckage? Go. One more minute. I'm going to invite you back together. I know that is not long enough to dig into all of the things that brings up. You will have another shot at going back to each other. I'm going to take a stab. We're going to read some scripture here, and I'm going to take a stab and see if I remember people's names from earlier today. So if I encountered you, look out. Let's see. Clinton? Okay, I remembered. Yeah, if I don't remember, you don't have to read, but I remembered, so you're stuck. Would you mind reading this? So. All right, so you know that thank you. This is the big shipwreck story in Scripture, right? Acts 27. It's a very long story, but the setup for this is, right, that it's in the fall, so it's harvest season. The ship is laden with grain. They're going to trade it. They're somewhere in I forget the name of the city. No, not yet. Anyway, they've got this. They're starting in the Middle East and they're heading towards Rome, and they're going to sell the grain. But they've got a bunch of prisoners on that ship too. Paul is one of them, and Paul, of course, says this is a bad time of year to be doing this. There's going to be a storm, and later he can't resist saying, "Told you so," But they go anyway, and they get hit with this storm that blows them completely off course. Right? Okay, Jasmine. Okay, so if you could read the next one. So the story picks up here. So they've got, they wind up seeing land, but they have no idea where it is. They don't know where they are. They've been blown off course. Some variations of this text, it says they saw an unknown shore. Okay. And so let's see, Stephanie. Okay. If you'd take it home. Okay, thank you, you guys, for playing along. So obviously, this is a very extended story, but the long and the short of it is they have this terrible shipwreck, and nobody dies. That's the main thing. So I think this is a story of hope, right? It's a good news story. There's actually good news in shipwreck, right? And there are three things in particular that I take away from this story that give me some hope on this, right? The first is that the same ship that broke apart was actually the ship that helped save them, right? So I take that to mean that just because the church as we know it feels like it might be going to pieces, doesn't mean that God is not still using it to save us, okay? So number one is the image of the ship. The second thing that I think is important is what we just mentioned. They found themselves on this unknown shore. They didn't know where they were. They had all of their usual tools and ways of going about life were at the bottom of the ocean at this point, right? And so they have no idea where they are. Remember, and where are they? You know this. That's the right answer. You can say it right. And this whole unknown shore image sure feels familiar because we've been washed up on an unknown shore too, right? We have found ourselves, many of us, in the middle of a situation that we know nothing about culturally. This whole post-pandemic reality, we are now dealing with tools that we don't know what to do with. Crypto, AI, ChatGPT. I mean, now somebody knows how to use those people. Somebody on Malta knows how to use them, but we have to be their students, right? These are not our usual go-tos. And then, of course, the third thing is, if Malta saved Paul, I wonder what that means for us. So here's what I mean by that. Malta today is one of the most Christian countries in the world. It's 95% Catholic. And every year they have huge festivals to celebrate Paul's shipwreck. And they start from one end of the island and go to the other in these parades, and the kids will be on balconies and they throw flowers over at people on the streets, and all of the doorways are festooned with these gorgeous flowers, and it's a big to-do every year, the festival that celebrates Paul's shipwreck. The reason is because Paul is the patron saint of Malta, and the reason Paul is the patron saint of Malta is because if you ask them, they will say, well, it's because Paul saved Malta. Paul brought Christianity to Malta. But if you read this story, it sure looks to me like Malta saved Paul, right? If Malta hadn't been there, Paul would be at the bottom of the sea. And so it makes me wonder if God used Malta to save Paul in the middle of that shipwreck, is it possible that in this period of turbulence and disorientation in the church, is it possible that God is using this unknown shore to save us? What if God is not using this whole period of stress and uncertainty in the church? What if that's not to sink us, but to save us? And so what we are looking at is another way of being on Malta. I think we are all doing ministry on Malta these days. We are all on unfamiliar terrain to a degree. We are all using tools that are unfamiliar to us and resources that we don't have a lot of experience with. We are all dealing with people who are not our normal people that we deal with in church. There are the people that are out there that are part of our ministries now that go beyond our congregations are not our usual suspects. We're trying to figure out what that means to be in ministry on Malta. And so one of the things that we're going to grapple with is the fact the good news is we're not going to die, right? The bad news is we're going to need a different boat, right? So the one that we thought we were going to be on is not functional anymore in many ways. Doesn't mean we're not going to use parts of it. Parts of it have come to shore with us. The whole thing is not lost, but we got to put it together in a different way. Now, the truth is that the young people we love have been on Malta for a long time. They've been here before us. And we're going to focus a lot tonight and in this week on young adults, primarily because the research that I'm involved in right now tends to focus on young adults and what ministry impacts them. And one of the things that we mentioned earlier, it's not just that young adults are being less religious. They're being religious in different ways. So we're going to talk about what some of those ways are. If we compare where we are in faith today with most young adults and where we were 30 years ago. 30 years ago, by the way, was when this college started their youth ministry program. 30 years ago was when Princeton started our youth ministry program. We've been worried about young people for a long time. But there are many things that look very familiar, but there are some significant changes, and here are 5 of them. The big story, of course, is that there is a dramatic decline in religious participation across the board. And that's true for young people as well as others. You can see the number of North Americans claiming religious faith. These numbers are from the Pew Research folks. They include Canada, I understand, in their numbers, so I hope this rings true for you guys too. But interestingly, if you were going to look at young people in particular, we need to blame the 90s, okay? Everything that was falling apart apparently started in the 90s. That's the story I have from this. Ryan Burge is the sociologist that's worked on this. And there are multiple reasons given. Nobody knows for sure. They theorize it might have something to do with the delay of marriage, right? Might have something to do with the anti-institutional bias that is now with us. The long and the short of it is, I'm going to give you a lot of these statistics. Almost all of them, I think all of them actually come from multiple sources. If you just Google what it is, you'll come up with 2 or 3 different sources that will say this, right? So what we know, it was during the 1990s that we discovered the nuns, right? And we were trying to make sense. We hadn't named them that yet, but we were trying to make sense of this phenomenon. And we know from the research that has come out just this year that the rise of the nuns, which is the title of all of the headlines, seems to have stabilized. It's not going up. It seems to start about 2016, that number started to plateau. Now, whether that is a blip, whether that is, a description of things to come, nobody knows. But the long and the short of it is, over the last generation, we had more people being religiously disaffiliated than at any time in our past since we've been measuring these things. And as you can see, among 24 to 34-year-olds, about the same number of people say they're Christians as say that they belong to nothing in particular. I'm going to come back to that definition of nuns in a second. Now, anybody got a sociology degree? Or you probably had a social class sometime, a few people. Yeah, you don't want to admit this, but I see you. Yeah. All right, well, if you have done any reading about religious identity and sociology, you know that religious identity is measured on 3 scales. There are 3 things, because sociologists have to measure things, right? So what they do is they look at these 3 things. They look at believing, behaving, and belonging, okay? Those are the 3 scales. And the idea was, at least when I went to seminary, was these 3 circles, believing, belonging, behaving, all were supposed to come together. You wanted as much convergence between those circles as possible. The more those circles converged, the stronger your religious identity was. It meant that if you believed something, it was supposed to shape the way you behave, and it's supposed to influence what you belong to, right? So you wanted those circles to converge. All right. Yeah, this is me playing with PowerPoint. Yeah. Okay. It turns out that calling this group of young people the nuns is a very blunt instrument. Because, as you know, you can be a nun in a lot of different ways. You might be a nun because you don't believe this stuff, but you belong to a faith community and you act like every other Christian you know, right? You might belong to a faith community, or you might not belong to a faith community, but actually buy into most of the belief systems. And, of course, the most common one is you might believe and you might belong, you just don't act like you've been told Christians should act, because who wants that? And so these various ways of being unaffiliated all have a whole different trail behind each of them. So what we're having to do is nuance this information about nuns. And interestingly, I just got an announcement last night. I'm just saying this so that you have this in your radar. A website is about to launch from Ryan Burge, the sociologist I just cited, and Tony Jones, who's working with them. They have a Templeton grant where there's a whole website that's going to collect all of the information about nuns that they have. And they're doing their own research too. So that will be a very useful tool for us. Okay, so it turns out the nuns is only a marginally useful category. And one of the reasons is that there are a lot of nuns who actually believe in God. They're called Ninos in Ryan Burge's research. Ninos is nuns in name only. Okay. So this is the first change, and it's the big one. There is a serious decline in religious participation or affiliation. The second thing that's happened, we just sort of hinted at this, is that religious identity, those 3 circles we talked about, has become unbundled. That's Springtide's language, right? So after COVID, we began to realize that young people no longer have the same kind of convergence of these 3 circles. They're not so worried about belief looking like predicting where they belong or how they behave. They're not really wasting a lot of time worrying about their behavior not matching up with the other 2 circles. You see what I'm saying? So let's use Lady Gaga as an example, okay? We know that Lady Gaga was raised Catholic. She went to Catholic school. She is a practicing Catholic. She prays. She goes to Mass. She knows her priests. She actually has a religious identity, and it's pretty clear what her religious community is. Okay? You ask her, she's a Catholic. Her religious practices sometimes look like a practicing Catholic, and sometimes not. So worship, prayer, also scheduling her concerts according to astrological charts. Yeah, she didn't get that from her CCD classes. And then the things that she believes also sometimes overlap with those other circles and sometimes don't, right? One of her beliefs says, I hope I'm teaching people to worship themselves. Her priest did not teach her that, okay? But these three circles in her faith identity have become unbundled. They don't necessarily overlap in the way that we expect them to. It is not a problem for her. She will still tell you, I'm a practicing Catholic. She sees no conflict in that. And what's happening is our religious formation is coming from so many different places now, right? That we are being formed as spiritual beings from many different sources, not just from a few, which was more true before the internet happened. So hold that for a second, we'll be back. The third change is that personal faith trumps church involvement. Now, this has been happening for a long time. As you know, it started in the 1960s, and the decline of young participation in churches has kept going down. But here's the interesting point in that. Religious engagement is no longer equated with belonging to a faith community. There is no need to belong to a faith community and be a religious person, according to most young people today. There are a few straggler contributors to that. These are just things for your information. One is, you might have noticed, a deprofessionalization in church leadership. I told somebody today, I have a conversation once a week with somebody in seminary who says, yeah, but I don't think I want to be ordained. You know, I want to work in a nonprofit, or I want to do something else, but I don't want to go. There are a number of people who actively believe that becoming part of the ordination process actually gets in the way of their ministry rather than facilitates their ministry, right? So this is a shift from when most seminaries were founded. At the same time, young people who do attend church, they feel great about their churches. So if you have young adults in your church, you are probably cooking with gas as far as they're concerned. You know, they love what they see in their churches. They love the people in their churches. They have very positive reports about where they worship. But we also see at the same time this drop in church going. And you can see the average attendance numbers there, okay? The fourth change from 30 years ago, and this is interesting because while all of these numbers are dropping, there is an increase in interest in spirituality. And this is true not just in North America, but in Europe as well. And so we're still trying to figure out what this means, but it is no longer embarrassing to admit you are spiritually interested, right? And that is a shift of the last few years. We've had a generation for which you kind of just didn't admit. You know, if you were in, and there is some research that said that if young people were in a context where they wanted to appear smart, like in universities, they would not admit that they had a religious interest. You know, you just don't talk about being religious if you want people to think you're smart. This is no longer the case. There's a lot of active interest in it. And we can see some of the resources or some of the statistics that go with this. Most young people say they're slightly religious, and even more say they're at least slightly spiritual. In the UK, this is a study that was done there. You can see a rise in the number of people who say they believe in God, and a decline in the people who say they're not religious. And this is in the UK, which, you know, we have assumed was the godless place of Christianity for the last generation. So there's a slight uptick in religiosity, but really it's more religious interest than religiosity. Most of that uptick comes in non-Christian traditions. But they're glad to talk about spirituality, and this is interesting. If you ask them what the key spiritual issues are for them, here's what they say: mental health, environmental stewardship, and social justice. Now, what do you notice about those three things as their top spiritual priorities? Right. They're like, you don't have to be a person who's religiously interested for those to be top concerns for you. So there's not this idea of the sacred secular divide is kind of not on their radar. Okay, the last change. Because we've had 500 years of diehard empiricism. We've had 2 generations of declining participation in faith communities. And what that has meant is there's no longer easy access. Even though people are very happy to have a spiritual conversation, we don't have categories that we don't have a language to talk about it with. We've kind of lost the language of what spirituality and theological conversation looks like. But they keep wanting spiritual experiences. God keeps encountering them, so they keep having spiritual experiences. So what do you do with that if you don't have a way to describe it? And most people, it's interesting because they looked at some of the religious participation, and sociologists said, well, people are participating because they want to belong to a community, or they're participating because they want to be a nice person. But the truth is, when they got in there and did the research, multiple studies bear this out. The primary reason people wanted to be part of a religious community was they wanted meaning. They wanted to believe in something. And specifically, they wanted to believe in God. They're not sure if they do, but they want to, right? So the motivation for being part of these religious communities actually is pretty familiar to us. The problem is, because they don't have a language to talk about it, they feel like they're not allowed to call it a religious category. It's like, where does God fit if you don't have a category for a spiritual experience? So what do you do instead? Well, you keep looking for something to call it. So you might, on Sunday morning, you might be part of a running club. You might be part of a yoga community. There is no end to the number of people with MDiv degrees who are running yoga studios right now. You might be part of, I don't know if anybody's done CrossFit. There's a whole lot of CrossFit practices that look very familiar to people who are familiar with Christian practices. You might be part of a community garden. You might be part of a dinner club. You might take a sound bath, which is what Oprah recommends. And these are all vaguely resonant with religious practices, right? Or there's this one. You might download an astrology app. This particular app has been downloaded by 30%, almost 1 in 3, U.S. young women who are under 30. So a third of young women under 30 in the United States have this app on their phone. You might participate in pseudo-religious practices. So for example, workism. Anybody watch Severance? Okay, most disturbing show ever. But anyway, this is a great example of workism. Workism is where the identity that we used to find in our communities is now being supplied by our work. And that means our work is doing things that we used to do to build community, like in youth group. They're taking us on retreats. They're having, community building activities. They're trying to build all sorts of camaraderie between us. And I don't know how work retreats feel to you. It's that the forced fun factor is always a little weird. But this is happening in the work setting instead of through other communities that we're part of. McMindfulness, the whole mindfulness movement, is the secular prayer movement, right? We can't talk about prayer, but you can get lots of funding for mindfulness if you're working in this. Activism, of course, you put some mercy and justice into that sentence, and you've got a Christian practice. But activism by itself is also a substitute for it's a justice movement that doesn't necessarily need a religious mooring, and so is sustainability. Sustainability can also be a faith practice, but it's also a secular eschatology, right? It's a way of trying to prepare for the end of things, is sustainability. But none of this has scratched our spiritual itch sufficiently. And this is a reporter who summed it up by saying, Americans have not found a satisfying alternative to religion, which was an interesting statement. And I pulled this example off of an interview that this musician, Grimes, she's Canadian, right? Anybody follow her? She's best known for being one of Elon Musk's partners, right? But she's also a singer. And she said in this interview, I think killing God may have been a mistake. So, this is just evidence of some of the resurgence of spiritual interest, right? One reporter who was reporting on some of these young adults said that many nuns report that they have, quote, thrown out the baby with the baptismal bathwater. Yeah. So, now to be clear, most of them aren't going back to religion, but they are talking about spiritual things in a way that they did not used to. It's no longer embarrassing to admit that you're interested. So, descriptors of this current generation of young adults, they're massively spiritually curious. They're being religious in new ways. And it's not just because they're leaving church. Increasingly, this is why. For 43% of Gen Z nuns, they're not religious, not because they've left church, but because they've never been in church to begin with, right? This is new for us. We are not accustomed to all of my training was on the assumption that people were leaving church and we had to stop that, right? The idea that people have never been in church is a whole different frame of mind, which is one reason why we're learning a lot from missiologists right now. About 1 in 3 people who say they are nuns, who are religiously unaffiliated, were raised without religion. So, welcome to Malta. This is where we are. Okay, so, given all of this, what's the church's job in all of this? Are we supposed to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, right? Are we supposed to bring these circles back together? Or are we to draw a bigger circle? Now, the truth is we don't know. We don't know what our job is yet. We're still trying to figure that out. But there might be more options than just going back to what we did 30 years ago. Here's what we've been told we should do. If we just innovate, all will be well, right? The solution is in innovation. As you know, I'm all for that, but with some caveats, right? We want to be careful about when Christians talk about innovation, because we need to innovate on innovation. We can't just do it like everybody else. So let me set the stage for how we're going to think about innovation here. First, it's worth pointing out that over the last 30 years, the way the church has talked about innovation has changed. Some of you will remember that in the 1990s, innovation meant you had a new worship space, you had different music and different instruments, different worship, contexts, and this was innovative. If we fix the church, people will come. That was what we thought. Now, we've repented of that somewhat because, first of all, it didn't happen. We did some of those things, and it did not necessarily solve the problem. Today, we are much more likely to think about innovation as new ways of being with people. New ways of being with people. Some of that is product related. You've got an app that allows you to connect in some way. Some of that is community related. You're going to form a community differently. Some of that is practice related. You're going to do different things. But the point is, we're being called to come alongside people in new ways. And that counts as the kind of innovation that churches are looking at now. The body of Christ walks beside people where they are. One of the things that we got to keep in mind is that as Christians innovate, our plumb line here is different from the general culture's definition of innovation, right? First of all, our goal is not to innovate. God is the innovator. We are participating in we're not going to out-innovate God. Death leads to resurrection. We can't beat that. So, how are we going to participate in that? That's the way that we become innovative. And when God is the innovator, again, the rules are different from Silicon Valley. I'm going to set up a kind of a false dichotomy here to make the point, right? In Silicon Valley, for example, we celebrate great ideas. We want the best ideas out there. In holy innovation, which is the kind that we want to be part of, we're not called to have great ideas. We're called to have great love. Those are two different things. And great love may lead us to do something different trying to address. But the point is not the great idea. The point is the love, right? Secondly, you've heard this in Silicon Valley, the whole goal of innovation is the bigger, faster, stronger, But we worship a God who became human, which meant God got, smaller and slower and more vulnerable. Okay, so this is a whole different kind of metric. Sometimes the most innovative thing we can do is to do less, right? Silicon Valley is interested in what's new and shiny out there, right? That's fine. It's not that that's a bad thing, but Christian communities are much more interested in what is upside down, and by that I mean, what is Jesus doing to turn the tables, right? Jesus turned over the tables in more ways than just one in the New Testament. So what about what we're doing allows us to see the world from upside down the way Jesus does? To see from down low versus up top. To see from the people who are struggling from the people who are in power, that kind of stuff. And finally, Silicon Valley is interested in disruptive innovation. And that's fine. You want an innovation that's going to change things, it's got to disrupt an industry, that we get that. But the most disruptive thing that we know as people of faith is sacrificial love, right? There is nothing that's going to, undo things faster than that act of sacrifice. All of this shift in our priorities, it also, I just want to make the point, it also affects leadership in the way we are thinking about leaders. So for example, one of my students she made this observation: 10 years from now, more people will have a spiritual director than a pastor. I actually don't think she's right about that, but what is true is that there is a resurgence across, if you look at all theological schools, and I don't know about colleges, but there's a resurgent interest in chaplaincy, right? There are more people who want to be chaplains than want to be pastors. And a chaplain is somebody who is a spiritual leader in a secular place, right? It's a relocating of where ministry is going to happen. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow. Related to that, we had an event for young adult organizational leaders of organizations that fostered young adult Christian leadership and some of their young adult leaders. And one of the pastors of a large National Baptist church in Tulsa, he said this. He said, I thought I had to give up things I love about church to get young adults to come. But now I see that we don't need to build a new table. We just need to make the table longer, right? So there's this false sense that we're sort of repenting of now, that we've had to, stop doing everything we've done in order to do something weird, okay? Now, that's not it. It's just that we have to extend ourselves beyond what we've already been doing. So what does that look like? I'm just going to give you some examples. Some of these were on the cards that you just shared, right? One way of being with people is in community spaces. This is becoming a ministry space, is to go out into the community in very tangible ways. Dog parks, right? Playgrounds, coffee shops, yoga studios. This is a pop-up playground that a church does because in their community there are no safe playgrounds for children. They're all covered in needles and stuff. And so they find empty warehouses or empty lots that people will, and they just put up stuff. You can see cardboard boxes, pool noodles, all the weird things that they can find that kids will want to play with. Yes, it's so kids have a safe place to play. But what else happens on playgrounds? Parents talk, right? So they're building community at the same time, right? So it's a way of building community as well as taking care of their children. Being with in new ways sometimes takes place in home spaces. There are lots of churches that are exploring affordable housing, and this one happens to be a dorm community. This is a campus ministry at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And these two, a husband and wife, left Princeton Seminary, 20 years ago, and they went, like a lot of campus ministries, they went to this campus ministry at this big public university, and there was not a single student in it. And they're like, I don't know, what do we do? Well, there was an empty parking lot next to the church. And they said, well, I don't know, let's build a dorm. So they built this dorm in the middle of campus of this big state university that houses something like 200 students. In that dorm, they have all kinds of ministry spaces that are only possible if you live with people. So they've got lots of intentional communities. They've got recovery programs for people struggling with alcoholism and drug rehab and that kind of stuff. They've got a lot of other different, just endless degrees of different kinds of projects that are taking place in that dorm. And that dorm also generates $1 million plus in revenue every year that will fund that ministry for perpetuity. Sometimes being with people happens in growth spaces, learning spaces. This happens to also be a social enterprise, TriPi. The youth minister was called in and they told her, well, listen, we got to do something with girls in our community. Also, we need to solve racism. Go. And she's like, okay. She calls together a bunch of 8th grade girls from across the school district, different socioeconomic conditions for each of them. She lays it out for them. And one of the girls says, you know what this community needs? This community needs more pie. And so they started a pie bakery. And they started it in the church kitchen first. They sold pie after church. And it now is a brick and mortar store. They've got a food truck and a million other things going on. But the long and the short of it is, it's not just gathering kids to bake pie. They do that one night a week. They're there a couple other nights a week too. And on one, they do basically ramped up confirmation. And on one, they do life skills, how to build a budget, how to, save your money, that kind of stuff. And so they are growing together as well as being paid a wage for what they're doing. Food spaces are big for church. We naturally gravitate to food spaces. Dinner churches, cafes, gardening co-ops, anything that does food. Anybody know the GO Project, United Church of Canada people? Is anybody from United Church? It basically is a curriculum that is designed to help young people enact their faith in a way that impacts their community. And so this particular church created a giving garden. They grow things to give away. And this is done by the young people in their community. So food spaces is just a natural place that a lot of churches go to. Workspaces, being with people in workspaces. This is particularly promising in youth ministry spaces, particularly in the U.S. right now. This is a youth minister who was worried that the kids from immigrant families in their community were not coming to youth group because they all had to have jobs. They were helping to support their families. And he said, well, what if the church paid them? And so they start this worm farm as their youth ministry. And these kids work alongside people in the church. They mentor them. They also get job skills and so on. But they're also getting basically connected with other Christian youth. And it becomes the way this church is reaching out to those young people. Of course, there are also sacred spaces that we are with people in. Sometimes it's nature, spiritual practices, other kinds of numinous spaces. Okay, we could go on. We won't. Here's the question you're going to get. Because everybody's going to see all this other stuff and they're going to go, yeah, that's great what you're doing. But is it the church? Really? Is that the church? And that was a concern that I had too for a while. And a former student who teaches New Testament at Candler School of Theology kind of reframed this for me. He said, when Jesus was first resurrected, nobody recognized him at first. So what if we're not going to recognize the resurrected church at first either? Well, that kind of reframed things. So, for example, these are pictures of the post-resurrection appearances. You've got the Doubting Thomas story. You've got the fish fry on the beach, walk to Emmaus, the being at the tomb. I like the one with Jesus in the hat. I'm pretty sure that's exactly what he had on. Yeah. And this is my favorite one. From 1621, Diego Velázquez. And what you can see is that the servant girl is listening in on a dinner happening up there. Do you know what dinner this is? Not the Last Supper. Keep going. Emmaus, yeah. And you can almost see her thinking, wait, I've heard that voice before. Wait, he's been here before. And it's almost as though she knows the resurrected Christ before they do, which is a really Jesus-y thing to do, right? Remember the whole water into wine thing at the wedding? The first people to know that Jesus was up to something different was not the bride and groom. It was who? The servants, right? We're church people. We always think we're the first people that are going to know when Jesus shows up again. We don't have any evidence that that's going to happen like that. I think it's very likely we might be the last ones to notice. And so one of the things that we can do is to say, well, maybe we're just not going to know. We might not be the first people God reveals the resurrected church to. Maybe God's going to reveal the resurrected church first to the people on Malta. So here's what to ponder before tomorrow. Okay, first, God is the innovator, not us. Okay? So, what does it look like to take part in God's big idea instead of trying to con God into taking part in ours? Okay? Second, innovation won't save the church. Only Jesus Christ saves the church. So, Are we clear why we want to cultivate all this innovation? Is it so that we can be the body of Christ, or so we can save an institution? Third, maybe young people aren't leaving religion as much as they're changing what being religious means. So if that's the case, is that a threat to the church or an opportunity? And finally, what if the church looks different on Malta? Okay. Is it possible we won't be the first people to whom God reveals the resurrected church? Okay, those are kind of framing questions for the rest of our time together. And because of what I do, a lot of people ask me, so what's the next big thing you see coming in youth ministry? What's the next big thing you see on the horizon for innovation in the church or whatever, you know? And I got to tell you, I don't see a next big thing. And it's not because I've been looking, have not seen it. What I see is Dunkirk. I don't know if you remember that story from World War II. But there's a movie about it that's great. If you know the story, what happens is you've got thousands of British soldiers that are trapped on a beach in the north of France. They can't get off. They're on this beach. They're sitting ducks for Axis forces to come after them. And they're waiting for a tanker to come in and save them. What they don't know is that no tanker can get in there. It's too shallow. So they can't send a tanker in to save these people. And so Winston Churchill gets on the radio, and he radios all across the south of England and says, anybody who has a boat, can we use it to bring these people home? And so you had lots of people who participated in this. And in the movie, you've got this scene where this is what the soldiers are seeing. They're trapped on this beach, and they're looking out, straining to see the next thing, the next big thing, looking for a big boat that they can get on and get out of there. And it's not coming. There's nothing happening on that horizon. It is still as anything. And then, pretty soon, a boat shows up over here on the horizon, and one here, and here, and here, and here, and all of a sudden, there's a flotilla of these little boats, and some of them look pretty rickety. They don't really look like they're going to get out of the garage, much less across the channel, right? Some of them are new and shiny and all put together. But they are all heading in the same direction. And they all have one goal in mind. And that is, they're going to bring these soldiers home. And it didn't matter which boat those soldiers got on. What mattered was that they got on a boat. Right? I think this is the moment the church is in. We are in a period of 1,000 small experiments. Your ministries are all one of those. All of you are doing ministry in some way that is a small experiment that God needs to be put in the water right now. And one of the things that we can look at with these small experiments is just, some of them are going to last, and some of them aren't. Some of them are going to make a lot of trips across the channel, and some of them are going to be lucky to get one done. But the fact is, God needs every boat on the water, because young people who are trapped on a shore somewhere, and God is calling you to help bring them home. It doesn't matter where we start. It matters that we start. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So keep that so you can respond. So we have a time for Q&R, and if you start talking, I will tell you shush, shush, shush until I get the mic to you so that we can all hear and the people online can hear as well. So I'm going to start with it was more a comment, but it's kind of a question that came in online during your conversation, so I'll start with that one. The question was in regards to your observation of many people choosing chaplaincy, and she wondered about what you think on Malta the role of pastor might look like in the future. Yeah. How will that change?
Yeah, we talked about it in one of the classes I was in this morning, but you're right that the role of the pastor looks different in this environment. And I've been persuaded by, they're not alone, and there's a church in California that I've worked with that has this particular way of thinking about their lead pastor's role, and her job is to do three things. She's not delivering the ministry. She is kind of the talent scout, looking across and helping people figure out what the ministry that God has called them to and helping facilitate that. So her job is to inspire, right, and to notice and name gifts for ministry, to equip people for these ministries. And a lot of that equipment is the theological framework that they're doing that in. That tends to be the missing part for most lay people, right? And that's what you are equipped specifically to be able to equip them with. So inspire, equip, and then bless. Bless this work that they're doing so that the church as a whole becomes the sending agency out into the community, out into their families, whatever. She said, I used to get really upset that people were always having all of these family conflicts and all of these other things, they work conflicts, and they couldn't be part of the ministry. And then I finally realized, wait, no, that is their ministry. Being a parent is their ministry. Being a banker is their ministry. My job is to help equip them for that ministry, not trying to get them to be part of a church committee. So anyway, that's my first response. I'm sure there are many others.
Great, thank you. Put up your hand if you'd like to ask a question while I wander over and grab my phone, because I'm supposed to be monitoring the online questions too. Okay, wait. I just told you gotta wait until the microphone comes.
How does identity and who we are in ministry affect all of what you've talked about tonight? Because if you don't know who you are,
Right.
you don't know what to do.
Thank you. I now no longer need to give the third lecture. Appreciate that. Yeah. I do think that you're going to hear this again, but one of the risks of the whole innovation movement is forgetting formation. Because we are so busy doing good things, right? It can really quickly slide into a work righteousness thing. So that theological formation, that identity formation, seems to me to be fundamental and very easily lost if we aren't intentional about it. I worry about it becoming a cheap social gospel movement. And by cheap, I mean this: a social gospel movement that forgets that it's a gospel movement. It's got social down, but the gospel part, not so much. And so one of the things that we're having to learn is, unlike the early 20th century, which had multiple institutions forming people as disciples, which meant you could fill in the gaps for each other, you could correct for each other a little bit, We tend to have single stream formation right now. It's coming from one or two places tops. And so that makes it a lot more fragile. And so we have to figure out what it's going to be like to treat every ministry we do has to simultaneously be an opportunity formation, I think. So you can now skip Thursday. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture tonight. I appreciate it. You talked about the nun generation. I think another epidemic that's present in young adults is the research that shows this is one of the loneliest generations.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, social media, smartphones, you can go back to 2009 and start to look at that. But
right.
I liked how you talked about that there's a movement away from this believe before you belong.
Yeah.
And now what I'm seeing in youth and young adults that I'm connected to is belong.
Yep.
And then before you believe. I baptized
Absolutely.
a couple of kids this weekend who said the first time I came to youth group was the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere.
Yep.
The dilemma is that we're not just creating communities.
Right.
You talked a lot about different communities, but we're actually creating communities where the gospel is present, and it's the gospel, it's Jesus, that actually transforms those lives. So what would be your advice to those new types of communities that are forming around helping with the belonging piece to be able to move towards the gospel that's actually transformative?
Right. You're dead on center with that. We had this conversation at dinner as well, that belonging is the door through which young adults are going to need to move because of the loneliness thing. And I don't know like a quick way to answer that, except to say that those of us who are shaping these communities, we have to be articulate about our own religious identities, right? We have to say who it is we work for. You know, we can't, there are times when that's dangerous to say, and there are times when it's not, and we have to discern that someone on a case-by-case basis. Anybody who's done nonprofit work and has had to apply for grants has had to learn when you can be, you know, lead with your faith identity and when you kind of, that's at the tail of the conversation. It's not that you're hiding it, it's just what you lead with depends upon who your funder is. And so how we go about those conversations, I don't know any, you know, the truth is, we've known, this is Youth Ministry 101. It's the relationship. We can go home now. It's the relationship. And we don't know, it's not like there's a strategy that when you get in a relationship with somebody, you don't get in a relationship in order to get them to do a thing you want them to do. You get in a relationship because you like this person or you're curious about this person. And we have to learn who we are and be comfortable enough with who we are that when the moment emerges, we're ready for it, right? To be able to say, yeah, well, you might not think that God gave you this, but when I see you dance, I think God gave you that gift. And that means I should help you because I'm a Christian. That's what we do, you know? And without imposing that on the person that we're talking to, who might be in a very different place, we have to be able to say, this is why I want to be in your life, you know? Because I think you're awesome, and I want to know what it is that God, how God made you in this way, and to be able to support that. You know, when anybody who's in youth ministry knows that if you go to visit somebody who's not like you show up, this happened to me, you show up at somebody's dance recital, it's like, what are you doing here? You know, aren't you the pastor? What are you coming to my recital for? That's weird. But it's only weird for a minute because mostly they're grateful to be seen. It's the beginning of a relationship. And, you know, I've written way more pages than anybody needs because, and at the end of the day, that's all I know how to say is we've got to be better at being in a relationship. It's not that there aren't better and worse ways to do that, but yeah.
I did wait for the mic to come to me. This sort of dovetails on John's question here, but he's saying like this is the loneliest generation. One of the things that I've noticed is this generation's need for authenticity, and I'm wondering if you could speak on a little bit of, you know, just sort of in light of what you have just shared with us, and thank you, by the way, because I think this has been wonderful. But I've often seen sort of there's the church and the faith community that is sort of very much aware that we are in a shipwreck situation, right, and says, you know, how do we sort of reinvent ourselves in the way that you have shown us this evening? But there's also the faith-based communities that, you know, are saying, well, we're doing okay, for lack of a better way. And, you know, in so many ways, you know, the next generation doesn't see that as authentic because they see sort of the greater picture of religion, of like, you know, declining attendance and, you know, churches that, you know, it's pretty evident around here that there are a number of church buildings that are falling apart, you know, not very sustainable. So I was wondering if you could speak into sort of that level of authenticity that, you know, we're trying to sort of exude to the next generation so that, you know, we can be realistic of, I don't know if there's an actual question in here, but
well, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll just leave it at that for now.
Well, I'll just make the point that I think that authenticity is the new truth. You know, it's people don't have a lot of patience for truth because they think authenticity is what they're after. There's actually a pretty much the same thing in a lot of ways, right? But the difference is where that truth comes from. Whether authenticity often means the way I feel, you know, as opposed to, you know, an authentic witness from outside of me, for example. Yeah, I don't know exactly. You don't have a question. I don't really have an answer. I just think that you're onto something. Yeah. Yeah.
There's other questions too. Can you just quick follow?
Yeah, quick follow-up. I guess my question is, how, as a youth worker who works in a church, how can I convince both the church and the youth that I serve, as this is sort of the new reality of we're trying new things, or this is the necessity of how we need to go forward.
I don't know that you're probably doing this already, but one of the things that I think we get a lot of mileage towards authenticity if we just listen and let them help lead, right? We don't do ministry to them, we let them do ministry. So that I like to talk about youth's ministry as opposed to youth ministry, and so if their view of authenticity is on display at that point, they feel like they get some agency in planning it. They also learn a little bit about how, that thing that they thought was, so institutional might not be such a bad thing after all, because now they're participating in it. That's a pat response, but I do think don't do ministry to people. Let people do ministry. That would be the take home, I guess.
This is an online question. What question or questions should we be asking in this season of reconstruction or building little boats? It seems to me that we didn't do a good job responding or asking questions in the season of deconstruction.
True. How are you? Who are you? We're back to the relationship thing. I don't think ministry, it's not a formula. It's a response to someone you are connected to because God has put you two together on the same path for whatever minute that happens, And so I am suspicious of coming at anyone with a strategy, I think that I would rather err on the side of, helping the strategy emerge out of our conversations together. So, and I don't know if that's an answer or not, but that's my gut response. You can disagree if you want.
Hello, that was a very good lecture. I really appreciated it. So my question is this: you talked about the Gen Zs not leaving faith, but they haven't been to church in the first place. And I was thinking about it a little bit, and I feel that peer evangelism could be a tool that we can use to get them to church. So my question is, do you have any tips that you can share on how we can equip our young people to engage peer evangelism more meaningfully?
That's a really good insight. And the first thing that comes to my mind, it's just the first thing, is don't get them to come to church. Let church go to them. I think when we are trying to, do the catch and release model of that's got diminishing returns. So if we use come to church as our goal, even with peer evangelism, it quickly becomes viewed as, oh, you're just using this as a way to get me to do what you want me to do, right? Peer evangelism is it's the only kind that really works. Because, the way missiologist David Bosch talks about it, all Christians are just one beggar telling another beggar where to get food. And that's what peer evangelism is. And this is what happened to me. You want to come and join in? That kind of thing. It's simple, it's organic, but I don't think the objective needs to be getting them in church. That's the second or third thing. The objective is, we have a community of care together. And to be able to make that the response first and let the come to church thing happen down the road. That's part of that. We got used to starting with belief instead of belonging. And we've got to flip that, so that belonging to a community is not contingent upon behavior. It's just, you are seen, you are loved, you're enough, right?
Great conversation. That's a great segue to my question, because I know some young people, I might be related to one of them, who they believe in Jesus. They believe in God, for all kinds of different reasons. Some maybe had a church connection at one point, some didn't. But they're rough around the edges. You know, they're part of Malta.
Yeah.
And you said coming to church isn't the first thing. I'm not sure it's ever going to be a good thing for them. And so how do we encourage them? How do we support them? They're encouraging each other, but man, it's a wild world out there. Like Malta's a wild place, but they're doing it, and I don't understand it. And I'm pretty confident that 90% of our churches don't understand it. So I'm not sure I think bringing it into church tames the wild and might kill it.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what you think about that, and how do we then at least encourage what God is already doing in the lives of those kids, because it's different. And we don't recognize it, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that's really perceptive, and it is true that there's something to be said for the fact that, you know, and this comes out of the National Study of Youth and Religion research. You know, if churches are not on board with this way of doing the ministry, it can actually make it worse if you come to church a lot. You know, if you start buying in to the pablum that we call theology, that's not going to help. Now, I do think that being part of a faith community really does matter. You don't want to. We don't want to do this alone. We're not supposed to do it alone. But I'm persuaded that there are different kinds of faith communities that bear the marks of. Sometimes they become formal churches. Sometimes they don't. These little Christian outposts. Tomorrow we'll talk more about a way to think about those. They're not a substitute for a worshiping community. That's still important out there. But for some people, that is as far as they're going to get. And for some people, that may be a good thing. Because if the worshiping community is good, there's a study that was done in the UK that found that participating in a worshiping community actually damaged young people's faith rather than made it better. And so it had the inverse reaction of what you would think it would have. I don't want to say that that's across the board. The truth is that even those of us who are in the mission field, let's say, who are out there working with some of these other kinds of communities, we also need a place in a community that we get our souls fed to allow us to go back out into the field hospital. This is Pope Francis's field hospital image of the church. I actually think we can. I think they're there. I was telling in one of the classes I was in, I was talking about this wild church in Switzerland. We're patterning a program at Princeton after something this church does. This church was founded 30 years ago by a confirmation class. What happened was a bunch of kids in Switzerland, in the State Church of Switzerland, went through confirmation, and it took, you know? And they got through it, and they're like, okay, we're in. What do we do now? And there weren't any mechanisms for them to really be served in that community. So they said, okay, well, I guess what we're supposed to do, we should start a church. So they did. And they started a church that would make sense to them and their peers. Okay? That church today does not look like any state church you've ever heard of. You know, it looks in many ways like an evangelical megachurch, but it's got more, it's got some different things that make you recognize it as a reformed congregation. But those young people grew up, they became leaders in their community and in that church, and they kind of pass on that DNA to the people who are being confirmed there today. Now, it's singular because it's safe to say the state church in Europe does not know what to do with a bunch of kids starting a church. And it was interesting because they have a lot of young adults who are part of their leadership. And I was complimenting the pastor, who was one of those kids at 16 who helped start it, on the kind of leadership formation that he was doing with these young adults. And he started to cry. I'll cry as I say this. He said, he recognized how talented they were, what great Christian leaders they were, how important their ministry was. But he said, there's no place I can send them. There are no other churches that will welcome them. And so, apart from starting their own thing, And that's a problem in American, at least in the U.S. For American Christianity. I don't know if it is in Canada, but we have a long history of we don't like the way the church is going. Let's start our own. It's a Baptist thing. Okay, good to know. Yeah. And sometimes that's necessary. But I would rather start with some humility among our own leadership to say, let's turn over the keys, and the new church pastors are among us. The new Christian leaders are there. They don't know it, and we haven't taken time to figure it out who they are yet, but they're already there being grown and watered in our own communities. Let's give them a chance to do the thing. So I'm always going to be on the side of fanning for young people being up front. But mostly I want them to be able to invent the Christian community that makes sense to them in their world, and which I am not able to do without them. And there's a little bit of Samuel Eli thing, right? Eli couldn't hear God. So Samuel could. But Samuel didn't know it was God without Eli. We need each other in this. But we can't, but it wouldn't have worked if Eli said, I'm the priest, dude, whatever that thing is you're doing doesn't count. That's not what happened. So we do have a few models that we can build on. It's a great observation, though.
Many of the questions tonight have said, that segues nicely. So I apologize. This does not segue nicely. When you were talking about innovation in the Silicon Valley model and the church's response to sacrificial love, it occurred to me that often we understand innovation, sacrificing people, is just part of the cost. And the response of sacrificial love and living sacrificially is appropriate. The challenge, and I wonder if you could provide some wisdom on this, is that every new thing ever said we're not going to sacrifice the people, and then got blind to it. So how do we keep from developing blind spots?
Jesus, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of this conversation that boils down to humility, which is, at least in the U.S., is a virtue long forgotten. That might be a little truer than I even meant it to be. Yeah. And and part of that humility is to be able to be Eli in the story, and to recognize the mistakes we've made raising our own children, and to recognize that puts us in a posture where our hearing is not what it ought to be, which doesn't mean everyone's hearing is like that. There are young people all around us who hear God differently than we do, and to have the humility to say, God is speaking to you. That's our job, is to be able to say, that voice you hear, that's not your stomach rumbling. That's God. Now what do you want to do with that kind of thing? So it's a great question, and it's a really pat answer. Jesus. All roads lead to. But I think we've just got to, in a lot of ways, we just have to get out of our own way. And that requires us to be honest about our own faith walk, which is hard.
Kenda, just one last question, just for a time. You're giving us a lot of time, and you're talking a lot, and we really appreciate that. No, it's I feel I'm sorry. we're drilling you. I had a question for you about the three circles and the movement away, because the first thing I thought is it's so lamentable to be so disintegrated.
Yeah.
As a person, but my second thought was are the circles actually pulled away, or is it just that we're not doing the work to understand how these different practices have integrated with what they actually do think, and maybe they can't even yet articulate it. So, the Lady Gaga example, if we pressed her, she might be able to actually articulate how somehow she merged astrology with Catholicism and all that.
Good point. I do think that it's worth pressing the integration question. I think there's also a third image that I haven't played around with this enough to, so let me just float this in case it winds up in a net.
Floats them. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it float. Well done. I see what you did there. We talked about the drawing a bigger circle as being another way to unite things. I think that is an option. But as I do that, I'm aware of another form of unity, and that is the magnetic center. Where how a magnetic field, there comes a point where it doesn't pull anymore. It's not like there's not a boundary, but you really can't see the boundary. And it's not like you cross into some magical world, but there comes a point where you are heading towards a magnetic field, and you take a step towards it, and it begins to draw you in further. And that has a way of bringing things together, too. It's not held by something on the outside. And maybe the better image is, and again, we got to figure out how, we don't put Jesus someplace. I say, it's easy to say, let's put Jesus in the middle. Well, first of all, Jesus is already there. And secondly, we don't put Jesus anywhere. But to think about at least the church as being a magnetic center that can draw people in a way that allows for some of that integration to reoccur, but under different terms. I haven't explored that much, but I just wonder whether I'm overlooking another image. As you can tell, I play fast and loose with metaphors, so it's just the way I think about things. So it's not scientific, but maybe there's something to that. The integration is a thing, though, and we've got to figure out ways that help people do it, even if it feels unusual about how we're doing it. Yeah.
Let's thank her again for her time.